What's up, everybody? Welcome to the State of Wild, episode 47, a regular YouTube video web series podcast thinking. My name is Meowth, and as usual, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Roffle and Corbett. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Very late where I am, but it's worth it, I think. A little bit of a surprise. Something very exciting happened with the show. Very happy to jump in with this episode.
I'm doing great as well, and just as excited as Corb to introduce our guest, who is a senior game designer on Hearthstone, Dean Ayala. How are you doing today, Dean?
I am great. Usually I start every meeting with my mic muted, so I'm happy that I'm not muted this morning. Just happy to talk about Wild, talk about Hearthstone. It's pretty much what I do all day at work, so I'm happy to do it with some new people.
We're really excited to have you on. Let's just go ahead and start off with a pretty simple question. You've been playing a lot of Wild recently. What have been the main takeaways about the format from your couple of months experiencing it? Did anything stand out? Did you have a lot of fun? What were your favorite decks?
I've played a lot of Wild for forever, basically. I think it's pretty important to just experience, all the modes that we have to try to get a barometer for what's out there. You can only gain really so much information from data. It's like looking at this subset of players or this subset of players. So I try to play a little bit of Arena, I try to play some Constructed, but I think Constructed is pretty well taken care of by my team these days. So I try to play some of the other game modes. So for Wild, I played a lot of Secret Mage forever. It's a pretty powerful deck, has been pretty powerful for a long time. Played some other, simple decks like Even Shaman or Odd Rogue. It's like doing a bunch of achievement hunting. So just looking at some achievement and being like, all right, well, given every card in Hearthstone, what's the deck that I can build to, do this thing the fastest? So I had a pretty good time with that. But then most recently, I played I don't even know, probably 500 or 600 games of Hand Buff Paladin. Which I found was really fun. I follow Bodybuilder, who's the buff paladin guy. So he would make little adjustments to his decks. So I went through a lot of those iterations alongside him with things like Arcane Golem and a bunch of different charge cards. So I had a lot of fun doing that. But the diversity at the top of Wild seemed pretty fun to me. There's definitely been times where it's been one or two decks. I think in Wild, it's pretty unlikely that the very top of Legend you're ever going to be in a format where it's going to be, all 10 classes with 15 decks. But there's a lot of Dark Glare, a couple different variations of Mage, some Paladin out there. And then I think the thing that helps the most is there's just a wide variety of Reno Highlander decks. It's I would run into Priest and Mage and Warlock, and I ran into Highlander Shamans. Feels like you can kind of put together any class that you want. So recently, it's been Highlander, but various OTK decks whenever I'm feeling like I want to do something fun.
Definitely experienced a lot of your hand buff paladin stuff. I was the victim of that many times on ladder, so that was very fun to see. But yeah, jumping into next stuff, when you are designing a set when it comes to standard, obviously that's the primary focus, right? Probably for any expansion we expect. However, when it comes to the design, how much emphasis is there on Wild? Is it mostly a look, let's design stuff and hopefully nothing breaks, we'll just see where things fall? Or is there something sometimes a bit more to it, where there's something a bit more specifically for Wild when it comes to these sort of expansions and things?
Wild archetypes are pretty defined. So when you think about how we design a set for standard, the card pool is limited enough to where we can introduce packages of 4 or 5 cards to inspire archetypes. Whereas in Wilds, that is a lot less likely. You can imagine if we made 4 or 5 cards to inspire a Wild archetype, that'd probably be a huge standard problem because the power level in Wild is so much higher. So when we think about Wild when we're designing sets, it's more from we're making a bunch of tools, and the Wild decks are kind of getting adjusted little by little over time. Sometimes there's a build around card that synergizes so well with some really old set that it inspires a new deck archetype. But for the most part, we're looking at it from the perspective of there's just a lot of correlation between standard and wild. Like our goal with making Hearthstone cards and making these tools is that they're pretty fun to play, and that that correlates no matter what format that you're looking for. So I think the main thing that we look at, are we doing something that's like a mistake for those? I think recently it's not, it wasn't alien to us that, things like Spring Water were going to be really helpful to a deck that was already relatively powerful. It was just a matter of like, was that going to push it over the limit or not? And to us, like at least at the time, that didn't feel like it was going to be the case. Obviously, we kind of changed our mind since then. But we're definitely looking at things like, well, Dark Clair Warlock's really powerful right now. Hand Buff Paladin's really powerful right now. A lot of these Reno decks are really powerful right now. So like, are we going to be introducing something that's going to take the most played wild deck and then make it, way more played? That's the kind of thing that we try to keep an eye on to make sure we're not, pushing that format into more negative space.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of observed that playing the format, that there's been decks that get incremental improvements over time, and then decks that kind of get passed are a result of maybe not getting new cards introduced in more recent expansions. So recently we had a historic amount of unnerfs and card changes with the recent set rotation. How did the team go about deciding what cards should be rotated, and how have they felt so far with the cards that they chose?
Well, the philosophy is pretty simple. I mean, we look at all the cards that we had from the past, and ideally, we unnerf them all, because we feel like you should be able to view the cards that you remember, like the how you fondly remember your Dr. Booms and your Leroys and all these cards. Like, you should be able to go to Wild, and that's a place where you're seeing all these cards as you remember them, as opposed to these like much worse off cards than you remember them in a format where they don't really need to be that much worse off. So we'd love to unnerf them all, but then the simple philosophy is like, is the game going to be more fun as a result of that? And I think for the most part, a lot of the nerfs that we do are really only relevant to standard. Like there's not much of a reason for a bunch of these cards to be less powerful in Wild, just because the power level of Wild is so much higher. I think the only cases where we look at a card and we say, it's like, well, is that a good idea to unnerf? It's usually a case where if we unnerf this card, it's already seeing a bunch of play in Wild. So if we make, Leroy 4 mana, is that really going to make Wild more fun? And the answer to some of those questions sometimes is no. It's like, if we really fully unnerf Quest Rogue and then people start playing a ton of Quest Rogue, is that actually going to make Wild more fun? Whereas if you take like a lower power leveled card, and all we're really doing is, well, instead of no one ever thinking about this card again in this format, they might use it as a fringe option, and like some deck either now or some deck in the future, then that's something that's going to make Wild more fun. There's more options out there, and there's more ability for you to look at a bunch of cards and say like, oh, maybe I might include that. So there's not really anything complex about it. We just look at each individual case and try to make a decision on when people play Wild, is this going to result in a more fun experience?
I totally get that. I kind of building off of that, were there some specific reverts that you guys made that you were a little bit scared about how they might impact the format, like maybe the Quest Rogue?
I think there's nothing that was like super scary. I mean, especially in a world where changing things is pretty easy. So I mean, we can always revert. I think one of the things that we disagreed on as a team, which always is going to happen, was like Arcane Golem. I was like, one of those questions was like, if we unnerf Arcane Golem and we just make it a 3 mana 4/2 charge, is that going to be like, and everyone just starts playing Arcane Golem? Are we like super happy about that? And I think the answer was, it basically became like a fringe option in like Hand of Paladin, and then maybe some other decks will find some use case for it, but it's definitely not like overpowering the Wild metagame. I think in the case of Arcane Golem, was probably a pretty reasonable choice, like giving people some tech options that to have some finishing power in decks where they might not have had so much otherwise. So that turned out to, I think, be okay. Cards like Arcane Golem are all, anytime you put charge in a card and it's, less than 4 mana, someone's going to find a way to use it in some really awful way at some point. So, it's possible that we'll regret that decision later. But I think that was really the only one that there was a lot of disagreement on whether or not we should do it. I think looking back even further was probably like Raza. I think Raza is still like a question today. It's like we unnerf Raza, and that's really fun for some people, and it's really unfun for other people. The population's not crazy high, but it's pretty high, and it's the kind of deck that kind of eliminates other decks from the format, especially at super high levels. So that's another one I think looking back was a little controversial.
Yeah, so talking more about this, like the general experience of Wild and moving on from the reverts. Now, Wild naturally has much less information, smaller player base, less streamers, things like that. So when it comes to the format, are there really any decks that you can recall that the player base kind of just didn't really pick up on, that were very strong, that the player base particularly underplayed or anything like that? Just because, there isn't as much information out there about Wild compared to the standard?
This question comes up a lot, like, in standard as well. And not really. I mean, there's so many people that play Hearthstone, and there's enough data out there that it's really hard for, like, some secret deck to slip under the radar. The cases that, are a little, like, less interesting and maybe not the answer to your question are always the ones that are like, these are the most powerful decks, but they get played like the 7th most or the 6th most because they're just kind of boring. And that was like, even Shaman, even Paladin, Odd Rogue, like these decks that were like actually the best in the format statistically, but like everyone was playing Big Priest just because it's flashier. It's fun to do crazy stuff. It's not quite as flashy to just dagger up on turn 2 and win the game eventually. I think like the biggest disparity I saw was Odd Rogue was like the best deck in the format for a significant amount of time, probably like a 2-month period, but it never even like cracked the top 5 or 6 in terms of like population. And then in conversation, it was always like, oh, Odd Rogue is, it's not a deck that, the high level players play. I'm like, no, it's the best in top 100 too, by like significant margin. But obviously that faded off a little bit too.
Kind of in a similar vein, we've noticed as a player base, there seems to be a bit of a distinction between some of the more engaged rank bands, and so something like a Diamond 5 or around there, and High Legend in terms of the play styles and the deck, so those types of players like the Pilot. So example of this is maybe Dark Glare Warlock tends to be a lot more popular as you go up the ladder. Same thing was true of Snip Snap Warlock, where I think in the past we've seen people hang on to Big Priest maybe a little bit longer at some of those other or lower rank bands such as Diamond 5. Is this something that the team is aware of, and do they account for that in the design philosophy? Do they make cards for that that kind of hyper engaged, but maybe not somebody chasing ranks at the Diamond 5 area?
Well, kind of like I said before, we don't really design 2 archetypes in Wild. But like if you think about like how many archetypes there are for like Shaman or Warlock, or like in Warlock there's discard, and there's various control Warlock variants, and there's decks that want to damage themselves and then heal it back. And we oftentimes like hit these archetypes over and over again, like maybe not one expansion to the next, but like one expansion and 4 expansions later we're going to do a discard thing. We're kind of aware that, hey, we want to make a discard Warlock in standard again. Like is this A going to be too busted and Wild, because now it's like okay, this is the 5th time we've done discard, so it's actually going to get pretty good and Wild because they have every build around card. Like how does that deck play, and is it really popular already? And maybe we don't add something to there. But anytime we're basically building on an archetype we've already built, like the question is raised, like, is this going to make it more fun for that Wild deck? So I think just in terms of like building cards for Wild, that's like indirectly how it happens, but not like we don't open up. It's like, okay, here's these 20 cards, and we're going to take them from this expansion. We're going to design these cards for Wild. We're just making fun tools, and then indirectly those get used in Wild, and we're just trying to keep tabs on like how that might happen. In terms of like rank 5 meta versus high legend meta, I wasn't sure if that was your question. Like what's the difference and how do we think about it?
Yeah, how do you approach that from a design philosophy, or is there consideration given there?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of balance, we tend to balance for like the highest level player, not because the highest level player is more important, but just because that information basically always trickles down. Working on a game for 7 years, we have the advantage of we have tons and tons and tons of data, and we've been monitoring this for a really long time. So it's super consistent that like even if there's a meta in top 100, that's going to trickle down at some point. There's some exceptions like various like Miracle Rogue like decks over time that are just pretty skill intensive to play. Uh, those ones obviously trickle down a little bit less than like if Odd Rogue is really popular in High Legend and it's not popular in Diamond 5, it will be. It's just going to take some amount of time, and that trickles actually. It's kind of interesting to look at in data. Like it trickles down over time. It's really slowly because like if Odd Rogue's really popular in top 100, it will get to like rank 15, or I guess bronze 5 or silver 10. Like it will get there eventually. So we tend to bounce around like the highest levels of play, but there's always going to be a disparity in the kind of things that people play at the highest level. When you're playing at the highest level, everyone's just insane, like they're all really good. So you can't like there's some players out there like the Surrenders of the world or whatever that are just so insane that they can just play whatever deck that they want and then get to, top 10 legend. But for most of us, that's not really the case. So High Legend kind of has a like a very distinct meta just because everyone's really good. And when everyone's really good, everyone has to be playing the very best deck. And so when you're playing at that level, there's only a certain amount of decks that are going to survive just because there's like the skill difference is just not that big anymore. Whereas like in Diamond 5, the population is pretty big. The MMR disparity there is like really high just because there's that floor. So, there's people in Diamond 5 that have like a super low MMR that have just kind of been cruising along at 25% win rate. So whenever you get like a really high MMR band disparity, like there's going to be a lot of decks within that. Whereas like in top 200, the MMR band is like really tight. Everyone's pretty close together, at least in comparison to when you're looking at Diamond. So I mean, it's not really anything different than how Standard works. It might be a little bit more extreme, but I think that's mostly due to there just being more of those like big priest-like decks out there in Wild where you can just do some really extreme stuff, and people like the only kind of decks that people will play that will cause them to lose are the ones that do big priest-like things or Ticketus-like things. Like no one's going to be playing Odd Rogue when it's 45% win rate. Like nobody. But there's tons of people that will continue to like burn people's decks with Ticketus.
Yeah, so it's maybe more the disparity is information not trickling down rather than like different preferences in most cases.
I mean, I think the opposite. I think there's so many types of decks out there that are like really appealing to the player that doesn't really care about winning, that I think that those decks just tend to be played in like a higher volume in Wild than they do in Standard, because there's only so many decks in Standard that like you will still play for fun even if you're losing, whereas in Wild there's all kinds of those.
Kind of building off of this discussion, I think multiple times in the AMAs that you have done on Twitter, we've seen discussion about the Wild format and wanting to make sure that you're still appealing to these less engaged or more casual players. And who just kind of want to play their favorite decks and cards. And so do you have an indication of how large of a population this might be in the Wild format compared to the High Legend or highly engaged players? And also, have you just kind of seen any trends of player engagement with Wild over the years? Kind of a two-part question here.
Player engagement has been, I would say, pretty stable for a long time now, actually. And the only real difference in like wild player counts over the last like, I don't know, really even like 5 years or so has been it actually like trends upwards in the East. So like play in regions like China and Korea, like WoW is like just much more popular format in the East than it is in the West or in Europe, which I always found to be kind of interesting. The concept of card rotations is like a really accepted sort of thing in the West, where it's like, we grew up with games like Magic the Gathering. So we're like, hey, we're gonna just say you can't play these cards anymore that you bought. And everyone in the West is like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then everyone in the East is like, what? Like, that's bullshit. You can't do that. So people tend to end up gravitating towards Wild more in different regions. But I think, in the West and in Europe, been pretty stable, I think, in terms of how many people are playing, at least in comparison to like the whole population curve. Like sometimes Wild goes down because the whole population of Hearthstone is going down, and sometimes it goes up because the whole population is going up, but nothing that's really deviating from the rest of the game.
Okay, so Dark Lair was nerfed much more rapidly than a deck like Sniplock. Despite the fact that Dark Lair was a standard card and Sniplock nerf didn't really affect standard at the time. So with that change in response speed, is that anything indicative of like an overall shift in philosophy that the team had? Or was there something just unique about those two different situations where one was nerfed very rapidly and one was sort of left a bit alone?
I mean, it's a good question. I'm sure if I could go back in time and look at like our patch cycle and stuff, maybe that there was like some technical reason. And whenever we're doing a patch, we basically have to wait for a client patch, which is almost never ideal, or we have to push out what's called like a DOP, which is data only patch. That's pretty stressful on like, and when I say stressful, I mean like it just takes a lot of work from a lot of people. So I mean, depending on what was released around those timings, like sometimes dates can get moved, so we don't have to call in QA to work like 12-hour days on the weekend or something like that. But just on the differences between the two decks, I think one of the bigger differences was that Sniplock like did something pretty crazy, like the kind of thing that we're not really accepting of as like a super high level deck, but it wasn't as clearly just flat out powerful in the same way that like the original Dark Lair Warlock was. I think like when we're looking at data, data doesn't really like make our decisions for us, but the thing that it helps us most with is it lets us know how likely something is to continue versus how likely something is to fall off on its own. And always, always, always the best thing for us is if the meta is shifting on its own. Because as soon as we're coming in and we're making balance changes all the time, like if you're a high level player, you're a deck builder, the thought is like, what's the point in me adjusting my deck or building something or trying to counter this thing? I'll just wait for Blizzard to adjust the meta for me. And that's not nearly as fun of a mindset as like, I'm going to go and I'm going to figure this thing out and the meta is going to shift on its own and I'm going to be the one that gets there first. Like that's like a cool mindset to have in card games. We'd rather wait. So in the case of Snip Snap Warlock, it was just one of those decks that was powerful, but there was definitely some data to indicate that like there were some matchups where it wasn't so powerful. It was sitting around like 50, 51, 52% win rate in some cases, and it was like a brand new deck that people didn't really know how to deck against or anything yet. So there was some indicator that it could fall off, whereas with Dark Lair Warlock, there's no indicator it was going to fall off. It was just super powerful across the board. Like clearly, we needed to do something. And I think like in retrospect, Dark Lair is way worse now than it was back then. Well, I mean, we changed a lot of things, but like Pinflinger affected it and all that. But it's still super powerful. So like, imagine if we did nothing. It'd be pretty dominant right now, I think. So it was just very clear. Whereas with Snip Snap Warlock was like, there's a chance we could do nothing and things will shift on its own. And for Dark Lair, there's like, okay, there's no chance, we should just do something.
Yeah, kind of in a similar vein. The balance of the wild format has come up a lot of times, and there is some discussion around that about keeping cards that the same, so that returning players or even just players feeling nostalgic can pick up the decks that they want to play at any given time. So when it is time to maybe make a change within the format, how does the team toe that line between keeping things nostalgic in an eternal format and also trying to make for a bit of a fresh format? Is it is there a threshold that a deck or an archetype maybe needs to reach in order to make that change, or how does the team evaluate that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of factors that go into like why or why not we change something, obviously. I think the biggest thing that I just said this, I think, recently on like social media, but the biggest thing that I think players don't think about that we think about is like a primary number one goal with balance is after we make this change, is it going to be better or not? I think players tend to think of it from the perspective of like, here's this problem or here's this thing that's powerful, so we should change this thing that's powerful, but don't really get to the second step of like, well, okay, if we did this, what's going to happen? And I think oftentimes, especially in Wild, the format is so, I think, it's much more defined than something like Standard is, that's shifting a little bit more often just because the card pool is less and we're injecting cards at, when we inject 135 cards into a small card pool, it makes a lot bigger impact than it does injecting it into this huge card pool in Wild. So when you think about like nerfing something really powerful, what's most likely to happen is that like second most powerful thing is just gonna like rise up and be even more dominant. And then it's like, well, okay, well now what if we nerf the top two powerful things? Like, well, that probably just means the third thing is gonna rise up and be like the most dominant. So it becomes the snowball effect of like, if there's four powerful decks and we want to shake up the meta or like change the meta game, a lot of times in Standard you can just change one deck and that kind of mixes everything up, whereas in Wild is a little less likely to happen. Like if our goal truly was let's just shake the format up and we don't want these like the decks that exist now to be as powerful, there'd have to be some pretty wide sweeping changes, and some pretty wide sweeping changes to people that have been playing like the same deck and loving it for years now. And then even if we did that, like what's the result? Like, would it be more fun? Like, would we change it so there'd be this 5-deck format that is, stale, and then we'd wipe all those decks out, and then what would happen is, we'd enter a 3-deck format that would maybe be, potentially worse. So we want to be, when we're changing people's cards, we want to be pretty sure that we're creating a better experience. Like, it's not enough for us to say, let's just change all this stuff and we hope the resulting thing will be better or not. Like, there's always cases where we, you see something like Sea Giant Warlock or something where it's like, look, that's not even really Hearthstone anymore. That's you're getting to X turn and then you're just losing the game or you're winning the game. And I think when there's circumstances like that, or like Mage is sort of on the line of that these days, where it's like, oh, it's turn 5, I lost. But there will always be decks like that we're looking to change. And if there's ever a circumstance where we can change a deck and be like confident that the resulting meta is better, we'll do it. I just think that there's like less of those opportunities than most players might think. At least it appears to us anyway.
There's a reason that Reddit and Twitter are not game developers, right? When it comes to game balance.
I mean, there's when I look at like Wild Reddit and Twitter stuff, it's mostly like people who are extremely informed these days talking about stuff. So I tend to learn more about Wild from the community than I do in other formats.
Oh, there you go, guys. We're doing great. Yeah.
So the last one is another sentiment that's being brought up is from the community, I think, very often. And the fact that the cards that are core to some of these decks that you've been mentioning, like Snip Snap Warlock, APM Mage, in the past, stuff like APM Priest with Radiant Elemental, are these cards that reduce the cost of cards to 0. So Mech Warper, Canrathed, stuff like that. Is this a concern that is shared by the design team? And how does the team kind of balance the fun aspect of playing, 8 or 9 cards in a turn with the potential balance concerns that these cards might be posing?
Yeah, I mean, in Wild, this question is particularly interesting because, like, anytime we do any cost reduction effect, this Because oftentimes we'll make a card in standard that's not very good, and we'll look at it. We'll do our like power ratings at the end of an expansion, and we'll be like, this card's not very good. But someday in Wild, it's gonna be busted because it says reduce cost by whatever amount. And obviously, as we know in Wild, a great way to play decks is to reduce all your cards to 0 and then just play them all. It tends to be a recurring theme. So anytime we do cost reduction, it's dangerous. Of course, cost reduction I think is like reducing the cost of your cards is pretty core base mechanic of a card game, in the same way that increasing the attack of your minions, like, it can just be an interesting thing to do. The fantasy of slinging a bunch of cards in a turn, playing those 10 or 11, 12 card turns, like, it's a really exciting moment. So when we're looking at cards like Sorcerer's Apprentice, like, all the time, we look at Sorcerer's Apprentice and we're like, should we, we keep having this come up. Like, do we really want to nerf the other mage card and not Sorcerer's Apprentice? Like, wouldn't nerfing Sorcerer's Apprentice like solve all of our problems? Like, we're aware of that, and it always comes back to we're really careful to try to not to just shave off all the extreme circumstances in Hearthstone. Like, Sorcerer's Apprentice does a pretty unique thing. Like, it's fun to take those turns. Like, going back way in time to something like Freeze Mage, like, we could have just changed Ice Block instead of just nerfing a bunch of freeze cards. But what that deck was, it was a unique experience. Like, if every deck that you played was just even Shaman and Odd Rogue and Tempo deck and Rush Warrior, but like, those decks are fun. But if that was the whole experience, then I think Hearthstone loses a lot. Like, the game is, there's a lot of tempo decks, there's a lot of minion based decks, and then you run into your freeze mages and your sea giant warlocks and your barns priests, and some decks that people like on their own, people might think of like, oh, this is resulting, Hearthstone is a negative experience, or those playing against those decks is, but they make Hearthstone, I think, a much more textured experience. Like, when you can run into your Aviana Coon decks, and it makes you think like, wow, there are really crazy things that happen in this game. And it's not just, who played their bigger minion on turn 5 and then won tempo and then won the game. Like, I don't want to downplay how interesting those games can be, but if the other extreme circumstances don't exist, we lose a lot. So when we look at something like Sorcerer's Apprentice or cost reduction stuff, we'll make the change when we have to, but just because something like APM Mage exists, I think it's really great if that deck exists, as long as it's, not, you don't have to play it because it's the most powerful thing, and it's not showing up in 9% of your games. And APM Mage has actually been really close to being something that, hey, maybe we should actually just change Sorcerer's Apprentice. So I'm not saying that it's like the wrong answer to do that. It's just, we're really, really careful because those archetypes are some of the things that make Hearthstone special, and we don't want to just like say that's a crazy thing that's happening. Let's just, someone's having fun. Let's make sure to not let them do that anymore. It's just important to be careful of that.
Do you guys have any more questions? I think we've reached the end of our pre-planned questions.
Yeah, and I think we've used enough of Dean's time. I really appreciate you joining us. This is a lot of fun for me, at least. I'm sure the same is true for everyone else. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I'm going not going to be at work for a while here in the future. Just going on vacation, but when I get back, I'm always happy to come on the show again and talk some Wilds. Wilds is my favorite format right now, so I'm playing a ton. So anytime you want to talk, hit up Fabio, and then maybe I can come back.
Yeah, really appreciate that, and definitely have to take you up on that at some point. So thank you again so much.
All right, cool. Take it easy, guys.
And we're back, and I hope you guys enjoyed the interview with Iksar. It was actually a pleasure getting to talk to him about the Wild format, and looking forward to having him on the show again sometime soon.
Hopefully. He did kind of leave that door open for us, so I'm sure we'll attempt to take advantage of it again.
Next time, it's up to one of you guys to slide into his DMs, not me, okay?
No pressure, right? Yeah. No, I wouldn't have missed that for the world. Well, maybe for the world, but I wouldn't have missed it for like a couple hours sleep. So it was very worth it, I think, to hang around for the exciting interview.
Yeah. And we hope you guys enjoyed it. Before we hop into the second half of our episode, we do want to take a short minute here to do our little bit of a sellout because we didn't normally do this. So first of all, just a reminder to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you guys enjoy the interview with Iksar so that you guys know when the future one goes live. But also, today we are also going to be announcing the launch of our new Patron. And so what this is, in addition to listening to the podcast or watching it, as well as supporting our Twitch and YouTube channels, we now have an additional way to support the stream over at patreon.com/stateofwild. There's a couple of tiers of support. So obviously you don't have to go out of your way to support, but if you guys do want to, there are a couple ways to do that. And the additional tiers give you access to different types of perks for supporting, including having your name featured on the show or access to our patron exclusive Discord that we've created, as well as access to some patron exclusive episodes that will not be available to everybody else, and as well as potential coaching from high legend player Corbett. Or if you're desperate, you can get it for myself as well. But I would lean towards Corbett because he's a much better player than I am. But yeah, make sure you guys check that out if you guys are interested. And we do appreciate all of the support that the podcast has been receiving over the past couple of weeks. It does actually mean a ton.
Well, in addition to our interview with Iksar, we had a big week. So MiniSet was announced earlier this week, including a release date of July 3rd. One of the things I'm most excited about, though, is it does follow the same monetization model as the previous MiniSet, which was kind of expected. They had alluded to that in the past. But I think that is a good way to go about releasing these MiniSets. So I believe it's 2K Gold or $20, was it?
I believe so.
So, again, the fact that you can just buy the entire set with gold, though, is a pretty big advantage for free-to-play players, as well as those cards will now start being available from packs. So I'm going to take a look at some of the cards that have been released so far. A few of these do have rough translations, so the wording may not be exact, but we have a good sense of what they are. So
yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and start off with like the one everybody is talking about. So let's talk about Mutanus the Devourer. 7 mana, 4/4. Neutral legendary Murloc. Great start, right? Great start. But the battle cry. Eat a minion in your opponent's hand. Gain its stats. So like we have every time there is disruption, there is an outcry in the community about how broken and busted this is. But after we've had a couple of days to think about it and, digest some potential decks that it might fit in, what are y'all's feels about Mutanus the Devourer?
My initial reaction to this was that it's a good card for Tech Shaman, which means it's a bad card in general. I think 7 mana is a lot slower than a fair number of combo decks in the format right now. So not only do you have to draw the lone copy of this, but you have to play it before the opponent kills you with a combo, which is, a pretty big ask. I think it has a unique effect because, I don't know if you mentioned this, Meowth, but like the Eat effect pulls it from hand. It doesn't add it to a discard pool. It doesn't add it to a death rattle pool. It doesn't trigger the death rattle. It just removes it from play, essentially, and it never returns. So it's kind of a unique effect in that regard, that it works almost as 2 cards, because when you do play a Dirty Rat, unlike many of my opponents, you do need a follow-up in order to actually remove the thing that comes out a lot of time. And so this is a 2 cards in one, in that it removes the card that it's also pulling. So that's a bit of a unique effect, but I don't know yet if that's going to be enough to offset the huge cost that it has. I could see it maybe as a 3rd Murloc in Reno Shaman, but then you're giving the trade-off of consistently having your Flurgle effect. So I think that interesting card, probably too slow for the format.
Yeah, I think it's very funny. Very entertaining card. I want to play like Nom Nom Cookie Monster LPG Mage, where you just get to play Bran and then this, Zola it, and do a whole bunch of stuff like that and eat your opponent's hand. That sounds hilarious. But 7 mana is a lot of mana. It's like 7 entire mana, in fact. And that is very expensive in Wild. And it's very hard to see like this kind of card. Just because it does have very limited board impact, obviously. It's just like a pile of stats for 7 mana, and it's very hard to get away with that, even in a deck like Reno Lock or Tech Shaman, as Roffle mentioned. And so, yeah, I think, there are obviously going to be matchups where it's good, and so it's very easy to envision the games where it pays off, where you eat the Raza, eat the Spawn, things like that. But again, 7 mana is very expensive in Wild. I think that the one thing that could kind of slightly push it over the edge is that it is a Murloc, so it does work with the new Zoth. And so in a deck like Reno Warlock, where you're currently not having a Murloc in that slot, that is a very small added benefit. I know it's just a 4/4 by itself, but it just makes it a little bit more consistent and makes a 4/4 does matter in some sense. So yeah, I guess like Renolock is the only real home. Odd Warrior maybe, but again, it's very slow. 7 mana's a lot in this format. So
yeah,
it's also
go ahead.
It's also more of a legitimate threat on its own when the turn that it comes out too, just because it does gain some stats. I think that you're on the right track with the LPG mage. I didn't think about that, but that makes a lot of sense because the limiting factor is you're paying 7 mana for it. Why not just pay 1 instead?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are, I don't know, overreacting to the fact that like it doesn't pull the minion, right? It's like, oh, the downside of pulling a Baku or a giant against Dark Glare, it doesn't matter, right? Because it's not being pulled on the board, but I don't know, getting to turn 7 against those decks doesn't really seem, I don't know, Dirty Rat's at least useful against aggro. This card is useless. So
it's a 2/6 taunt. That can be relevant and has some upside on the body. So, and it's 2 mana versus 7 mana. So it's a big difference.
Yeah. The only deck that I actually think that this is like completely viable in is Odd Warrior, because now it's an odd cost consistent combo disruption tool. If the deck wants it. Right now, I'm not even sure that the deck wants it, but if it does, it now has access. Because I know we were running Zul'jin for a little bit in that deck when Zul'jin came out, and I think this is just straight up like much better than Zul'jin in Odd Warrior. So competitively, I think that's the only deck that we'll see Mutanus in. That's not going to stop me from playing Shudderwalk Shaman with this, and you're talking about an LPG mage, just infinite Shudderwalks and like Prison Shaman with the armor vendors and plate breakers, and then and with Mutanus, like just nom in the opponent's hand over and over, like infinitely. It's while milling them out and gaining 1 billion armor. Sounds like a lot of fun to me. So
yeah, that was my first thought with it. Yeah. But Odd Warrior also does make sense just because you have the advantage of like buffering your life total, so that like damage combos can't kill you before turn 7. So you do have a little bit more time there. But it's more just that Odd Warrior can't run Dirty Rat, so it could potentially run those.
Yeah, I also like, God, the big thing with Shaman is like it does screw with your Flurgle Toxin combo. I think this would be an okay card, like in something like Shaman, because you have Shudderwalk, except it's a Murloc. And so I think the fact that it's a Murloc is kind of like hurting its viability. Like strangely enough, I think it's like hurting its viability. I think in our format a little bit more than one might think. All right, let's move on to our next card. We've been talking about how bad Mutanus is, but let's talk about potentially how good this card is. Primal Dungeoneer. 3 mana, 2/3 Shaman minion. Battle Cry, draw a spell. Wait, is this card draw in Shaman? Am I reading this correctly? Oh, but there's more. If it's a nature spell, also draw an elemental. Wait, this is a 3 mana, 2/3 draw 2 in Shaman? No way, dude. I'm really, really hype about this card. I think this card is pretty nuts. What are y'all's thoughts and feels about Primal Dungeoneer?
So a lot of times when I evaluate conditional cards, I like to just like look at their baseline ability, right? So 3 mana, 2/3 draw a spell. It's pretty good, right? There are a lot of key spells that you want to draw in your Reno, your control shamans. You're not running a great number of spells to begin with, so targeted draw is going to be a little bit better. You're going to get your big removal that can hopefully buy you time against aggro or whatever the case may be. So that alone is pretty good, but then the fact that it has some upside, I don't know how many nature spells like a typical Shudderwalk or control shaman type deck is going to want to run. Or even an elemental based shaman is going to want to run. But the fact that it does, help you tutor for Zephyrus or Grumble, like I've at times ran Sandbinder in my Shudderwalk Shaman just to fetch those cards more consistently, and this just is a better version of that. if you're not running a Reno version, which you know, I don't know if that's ideal or not, but like it also has the potential to be repeated with Shudder too, and without like having concern for fatigue once you get to like the infinite Shudder game too. So I think there's a lot going for this. It's just I don't know how often you're getting that second effect, nor how much you want to build around this one card, but it is looking promising at least.
Yeah, I think you kind of always want to be hitting that elemental draw, or at least like the vast majority of time. So like in a deck like Reno Shaman, your spells really aren't that great as they are. Like you don't tend to run the highest spell count, and you do have a lot of good nature spells. So things like Devolve, Maelstrom Portal, Landslide, Lightning Bolt, and the Serpentine Portal are all nature spells, and there isn't really that much that you're looking to cut. You cut like a Devolving Missiles potentially, and I think in Reno Shaman specifically, the one spell that you play that isn't a nature spell is Ice Fishing, and you just give up that draw because, well, you drew Ice Fishing. That's like the nuts for Reno Shaman. It's not really a downside to get access to the guaranteed Toxfin combo. And so, the fact that like your elemental is Zephyrus in that deck as well, you obviously probably want to run maybe 1 or 2 more elementals just to make it, in case you're not dead drawing if you hit the Zev early. But in that kind of deck, targeting like very, very likely to tutor a Zephyrus and Reno Shaman, and again all these other 0 like local spells, 3-mana draw 2. Really good in that deck. I also am kind of excited to try it out in like an aggro shaman deck. I think like an aggro shaman with this could be really fun. There are like a lot of good nature spells that go face, whether it's Lightning Bolt or Crackle. And I think it could be really fun to try sort of build an elemental shell around that with the like kindling elemental and things like that. I think like an aggro Ellie Shaman could be a fun spin. But again, Shaman's so far behind that we just need to see more, We need to see more of these cards, but I definitely think this is an excellent support piece for sure, and a great way to move forward.
Yeah, I know a lot of people were talking about like Reno Shamans and Shadowwalk Shamans with this card, but yeah, my mind went the same way, which maybe, illustrates how much of an aggro player I've become over the past couple of months, where like the first thoughts were like the aggro shaman with like the new buffed Unbound Elemental, right? So the deck that I was playing with Brew Khan that was running nothing but nature spells anyways, and then you hit like the elemental that you're pulling is either Cage Match Custodian, which draws you damage, it draws you Unbound Elemental, or draws you Thunderhead, all of which are very, very good cards. And then shoutouts to Lion. Lion and I were talking a little bit. Jade Shaman, I think, loves this card, right? So I know Jade Shaman is not the best thing in the world, but if you make it so that you're drawing only nature spells, I mean, Jade Lightning's a nature spell, Serpentine Portal's a nature spell, Lightning Bloom. Stuff like Jade Spirit is an elemental. Cage Match Custodian's an elemental that draws you Jade Claws, right? Like, you can do some finagling with that. But I do think Aggro Shaman, it's probably the one that I'm going to lean towards the best, because I think that's a deck that I already played when Unbound Elemental got buffed, and it felt like it was kind of close, right, to being a real deck. It was missing a little bit of refill, and this is kind of exactly what that is. It's draw, it's refill to help you, finish the opponent if you like run out of gas, and this, helps you stop that. So I'm excited about this primarily in the Aggro Shaman shell. I know a lot of people are going to shove it in Shadowwalk Shamans and Reno Shamans, which might be fine, and that might be good, and it probably will be because yellow cards are good, but I'm really excited about this in Aggro Shaman. I do really like it, and I do think that it itself is not going to push Shaman over the edge. It's going to need like the other 2 or 3 cards that it gets from this mini set to be really good as well, I think. But I'm excited, and it's a good start.
Yeah, the funny thing about this card is that it's a nature support card that tricks you into thinking it's an elemental support card. Like this is all about nature, and it's easy to get distracted by the elemental tag there at the bottom because of how much attention has been given about the elementals recently. But yeah, this is all about the nature spells and the added bonus for just a small package of elementals. All you need.
Let's talk about our next card here. The second of the 3 Dungeoneers. We've got Frostweave Dungeoneer. This is a mage, 3-mana 2/3 minion. Battle cry, draw a spell. If it's a frost spell, summon 2 1/1 elementals that freeze. So you're going to see a little bit of a trend here with these Dungeoneers. This mage one, though, I'm not gonna lie, feels a little bit out of place on the surface, right? It doesn't really fit into a lot of the existing shells, but very similarly to the Shaman card, it looks like it's got, that strong potential that might be built around worthy. What do you guys think?
I don't know that the payoff is worth like building your deck entirely around frost spells. There are a lot of good frost spells in Wild in particular. You've got Ice Lance, Frostbolt, Ice Block come to mind immediately. But like those alone don't really make for a deck, and those don't really benefit a whole lot from summoning 2 1/1s on top of this. So it's a 3 mana Yeti, right? The freeze sometimes relevant in certain matchups, but like they're too fragile to consistently rely on, I think. So I feel like there's a mismatch between the payoff of it and the way that you're tending to build your deck if you're building it around frost spells. But again, it is targeted draw if nothing else.
Yeah, I think this is much more of a standard directed card, right? Like this would probably be more useful there, where they have like brain freeze and things like that, where you can actually sort of build a more curve based deck with this kind of restriction. In Wild, it's very hard to actually build a mage deck that makes sense. Like Roffle says, that actually wants this payoff. Like it's just a little mismatched for Wild specifically.
Well, I mean, what are the good frost spells that you actually want?
It depends on the direction of the deck is the whole problem, right?
Yeah.
Because like you can go for the direct damage thing with like frost bolts and lances, and like ice block is a frost spell which helps. But a lot of the payoffs are things like Ray of Frost, Frost Nova, Blizzard, very defensive cards a lot of the time. And so that kind of shell, it doesn't really work in Wild right now, where the decks are so combo focused with like Refreshing Spring Water and Flow, which doesn't work with this. Or there are things like Reno Mage, which again doesn't really work with this. So yeah, it's just hard to figure it out.
Well, okay, I mean, Reno Mage, what about just running this in Reno Mage as a way to tutor Luna's Pocket Galaxy? Because in Reno Mage, you run, what, 5 or 6 spells? You run Pocket Galaxy, you run 2 Secrets, you run Potion of Illusion, and then you run Book of Specters as like your 5 main core spells, and then you can run Ray of Frost, right?
You know this one, you're playing like a big Star Scryer?
Well, I mean, this is a Star Scryer that like, even if you don't hit the frost spell, you're fine. And because it's a battle cry, I think it's better than Star Scryer, because LPG Mage is all about manipulating battle cries, right? So, I mean, Star Scryer is not something that I'm like rushing to try to force in my deck, right? But it's, I know, battle cry draw a spell, I think is just a lot better than death battle draw a spell. And I think if you hit the frost spell, right? If you hit the block, you hit the Ray of Frost. That upset of 2/1 elementals. I think that's, I mean, they're not great, but like, that's a lot of tempo against both aggro decks and, if you're like an LPG mirror.
Yeah,
it's relevant.
When I play LPG, though, it feels like a coin flip in terms of whether I even want to draw the LPG. If I have the turtle, I'd rather it stay in my deck. If I have the Dragon Caster, obviously I want it. So, like, I don't know. I'm not sold on that. In Pocket Galaxy, I could see it in like a, just a Battlecry centered Reno Mage, a more controlling version where maybe you do run some of those low cost spells, like Corbett was talking about, the ice or the Ray of Frost, the Frost Nova, the ice block, and then you get a similar effect, but without, or with it more consistency from it, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe it's time to bust out that Antonitis Reno Mage again. The 1 mana Antons with all the damage. Maybe it's time. We've been spending too much time on this mage card. Let's talk about the priest one. 3 mana 2/3 Battlecry, draw a spell. Devout Dungeoneer, by the way. Battlecry, draw a spell. If it's a holy spell, reduce its cost by 2. So again, following the very, very similar trend, I think the first question to ask is, does this fit in Reno Priest? How many holy spells is Reno Priest running? And if we're running a ton, do you think it's worth running in that deck?
I started doing a quick assessment of that, and it looks like most of the very good spells that you want to run in Reno Priest are shadow spells, and like you're not going to reliably get this off. So I think the question becomes: is this better than a novice engineer? You're paying one more mana for it. You're getting slightly better body and some potential upside. So I don't know. I'm not good at Reno Priest. The only thing I thought about when I saw this is, oh god, what if we get a paladin version? So I'm a little bit scared of that, but thank god this one isn't a paladin version, because this into Hand of Adal would be disgusting. But surprisingly, I think that Priest is running, far fewer key holy spell cards than Paladin. I think a lot of their a lot of the cards that you're banking on in Reno Priest are shadow spells. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, Priest is always pretty unholy to me whenever I play against it, so I can see that. But no, the ones that you do have in the deck are things like Palm Reading, Penance, Holy Smite, and Condemn. Like, we probably force a Condemn in. That's a goodish card anyway. So when this does pay off, like, it's very good when it works, right? Like, it's an SI7 agent with a Penance or a Smite with maybe healing, or it can be like a Ravaging Ghoul with a Condemn. But it's just not going to be that consistent in Reno Priest at all, because like maybe a quarter of your spells are holy. So yeah, it does just become that whole conversation about like, is it better than Novice Engineer? And the answer is probably no, because Novice can also draw your minions, and your minions are probably better than a random spell from your deck. But yeah, like, good card if the payoff's there. So maybe one day, we'll want to cut Raise Dead and Potion of Madness and Powered Shield and I don't know,
there will never
Psychic
be a day
Scream.
where you want to cut those cards. Don't.
Yeah, I think that there are just too many good again, shadow spells, because Insight and Palm Reading are both shadow. Your Shadow Visions, Shadow, or like Thrive. Like, Thrive is a good card, and I don't even know if you're running that in Reno Priest right now. Like, there are so many good shadow spells in Priest right now.
Well,
really good card in Standard, I think. I will say really good card in Standard. But
well, one last counterpoint about this before we move on from the Reno Priest. What if we're moving towards the Xyrella builds of Reno Priest that run Renew and I was gonna say Desperate Prayer, but like Desperate Prayer costs 0. But I mean, like, tutoring something like Smite or Renew and decreasing the cost, allowing you to combo it super easy with Xyrella, might be something worth, considering. But I also think that, like, on the surface, a 3-mana 2/3 draw spell is like, I don't know, that's like still pretty good.
It's okay. Yeah, like, it's passable-ish.
Yeah, I mean, I said this with the Primal Dungeoneer, that just like at its base, it's a pretty good card. You made the comparison to Starscry, and I think that like it is slightly better than a Starscryer because you get the card immediately. So, and you can manipulate its battle cry, and so these cards have a lot going for them. I'm curious to see if all classes get one, because they look fun, and I like sort of soft keywords like this with the Dungeoneers.
Yeah, I love the design of these. Like, they're very cool as support cards. I think they're very, like, not feels bad, but they probably enable a lot, which is always nice.
Dude, I'm super scared if Warlock gets one of these. It's like, draw a shadow spell, reduce its cost by 2. Like, oh god.
They haven't confirmed that. Have they confirmed that every class is getting one, or just that? Like,
I don't think there's enough spell schools for everybody to get one of these, right?
Oh yeah, true.
Well, not every spell school or not every class has to get its own spell school necessarily, but because there's overlap between them. But yeah, no, they haven't announced that every class is going to get one. So I'm hopeful that we'll. Yeah, exactly. I hope we get more than 3, and I would be okay if every class got one, just as long as it's not all cost manipulation like the Priest one is.
Yeah, very fair. All right, so these 4 cards that we've talked about so far, these are the official reveals from Blizzard. The next 4 that we're going to talk about are actually cards that may have been prematurely leaked. We don't know if they're real or not, but we believe that they are. Okay, and so we're going to go ahead and talk about them. These weren't revealed by Blizzard, though, so just just in case they're not real, we just want to make sure that we have that little caveat out there. But the first one we want to talk about, let's talk about Lady Anacondra.
Oh my god.
First of all, the name. Great name. But 6 mana, 3/7, legendary druid minion. Your nature spells cost 2 less. So there's some obvious synergy here with Celestial Alignment. Yeah. Whether you're playing Mali or Tog, I think the Tog version might be a little bit better because Overflow is a nature spell. UI is not. But yeah, so the idea is you play Celestial Alignment, make everything cost 1, and then on your following turn you play Lady Anacondra, and then everything costs 0 in your deck. And you just, you do things that involve you winning the game somehow because you play 40 cards in a turn. So yeah, what are y'all's thoughts about this? And do you think it has a home anywhere other than Celestial Alignment Druid?
No. No, it's either Alignment Druid or bust. I think that, well, I mean, maybe there's some cute things you can do with, like, Guff, but even then, like, Guff was kind of disappointing when I've played him in the past, so I don't know that payoff is worth. Nor is a 6-mana card in that deck going to be worth. So you don't want to pay 6 mana for this card, even as a Druid. I think is really what it comes down to. I think that it's getting a lot of, like, really kind of like Mutanus. It's getting a lot of really intense reactions from people immediately. I don't know if this card alone is going to push Alignment Druid in Wild any farther than it is, just because it already has some cards that effectively do the same thing. Is there a big difference between the answer is yes. Yes, there is a big difference between 1 and 0, but it's kind of limiting for Malygos because Malygos still needs to play their minions, play their Malygos, copy their Malygos, which I think Germination is probably a nature spell. But most of the damage spells aren't going to be nature spells, so you still need to find sources of damage. You're still probably going to need to reset mana in that deck anyway. Things like Overgrowth, Nourish are really your big hits off of that. I think Bioproject probably also a nature spell. So you do have some good hits off of that to gain some mana, but like you also need to then draw some cards and find some damage spells, play some minions. So I think it's probably more valuable in Tog Druid, like Meowth said, because the majority of the cards that you're going to want to play after the alignment are going to be nature spells anyway. You can also do things like you have Naturalize. I don't know about the Eclipses, but you can get some. Yeah, Solar Eclipse is a nature spell, so you can swap decks, double up a couple Naturalizes, and get some serious burst damage after you use all your nature spells drawing. So I think in a Tog Druid probably makes sense and is probably pretty good. As an enabler, I've always been skeptical of the Twig Sphere combo for a similar reason, just because, again, that's using 2 cards to replicate an effect that you can already get with a single card. And so this is kind of the same thing. It's a little bit redundant with what Alignment Druid already is capable of doing. All of that said, I think it's one of those cards that you really need to see it in action before you can make a proper assessment of it. It's hard to understand the impact of playing something like this until you actually see it in action and see how much you stall out with non-nature spells potentially. We saw something similar with was it Uriel, the spell Aviana, that it's one of those cards that needs to see play. I kind of see it similar to that card in some regards.
So I think what you said about the Alignment Druid and like, does this really change Alignment Druid is a good point, because for me, I like once the Druid plays Alignment, I don't think they tend to have problems killing the opponent. Like they take 1 turn off usually, where the opponent goes, and then they just win. They just go Nourish, melee, ramp up, refresh, kill. And so for me, that doesn't really change anything. Like the post-alignment part of this isn't interesting. So I'm actually more interested in this in a non-alignment deck, funnily enough. So I think that the fun thing about this card is that you can Germination it, because Germination will cost 2, which means that your spells now cost 4 less, and then you can Germination again to make your spells cost 6 less. And that Germination costs 0. So that's 8 mana, and you now have a 6 cost discount on your nature spells. Overflow now costs 1. Nourish now costs 0, so we can ramp up and do a whole bunch of stuff. So for me, that's kind of more the direction I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about this is Kael'thas. This is Barnes Kael'thas. And we try and like make a high roll druid where I don't know exactly what the win condition has to look like. I know that it can play things like Cenarian Ward for like 2 mana. You could double it up with Solar Eclipse, like make big insane swings like that. Things like for the Gloop. Gloop's Glorious Gloop is a nature spell. Again, it costs 1, so it doesn't matter as much. But I think that's more the direction I'm thinking about, because alignment doesn't need a way to like win the game post alignment. But I think that this could open up something cool with Germination. And I just want to see what we get in the future with nature druid spells, because the more like 6 cost ones, 5, 6, 7 cost ones we get, I think there could be something here with that kind of strategy instead. So that's what I'm looking forward to with this.
Yeah, you have the potential for something similar to the old Miracle Tog decks as well.
Yeah.
If you can regain enough mana to play the Tog, again, the Solar Eclipses plus your Naturalizes are going to burst down quite a lot. So yeah, that could be pretty interesting. But does require a bit of setup.
All right, let's move on to our next card. We've got Fluffy Winged Snake, 8 mana 4/9 beast. After you cast a nature spell, summon a 4/2 snake with rush. My initial impression is that this card is way too slow, right? It's 8 mana, so it doesn't go in the aggressive or mid-rangey decks, but at 8 mana, at that point, you better be playing Celestial Alignment. So are you guys in the same boat? Do you guys think that this card is bad or good, or what are your thoughts?
Not at all. It's not a good card for the speed of Wild, but I think it's a really cool card just because because of its big caboose, it just turns it into like an engine to generate 4/2s with rush, which is, that's kind of cool. If you can stick that and like get some value off of it, that's like, it's like a better Netherwind Portal or whatever is pulling out the imps. I think this card is bad, but it's pretty cool just in the like repetitive effect of minion generation on a minion that has a high attack. It kind of is semi-permanent in that way that you can kind of maintain board advantage if you get this rolling. But I think it's way too slow.
It's bigger Mount Seller, which I like. I think it's a cool thing. So,
all right, let's talk about these last 2 cards here. We've got Fluffy Pilgrim Ooze and Fluffy Pilgrim Spell. Obviously temporary names. One of them is a neutral 3 mana 3/2 with Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 Pilgrim with a random effect. And the other is a 7 mana Paladin spell, summon 5 2/2 Pilgrims with random effects. And so if you guys are wondering about what these random Pilgrims are and what these random effects might be, so what these guys are 2/2 minions that have a random unique effect or keyword. And so they have spoiled some of them. We don't know if this is all of them, but there is one with Divine Shield, one with Rush, one with Poisonous, one with Taunt, one with Lifesteal, and one with Wind Fury. So that is 6 keywords there. So, I mean, it ranges from Minibot to Frostweave Grunt, so that feels like there's a little bit of a spectrum there. Not the hottest, but, Pilgrims aside, what do you guys think about these 2 cards themselves?
I think a 7 mana summon 5 is probably not anything that Paladin wants right now. Like, people may be tempted to consider Odd Paladin, but don't. Just because, like, we've already seen that even like the 5 mana summon recruits wasn't good enough. The minions are pretty good. It's basically a lot of the keywords that exist. So there is some variance involved in that, but I think the Pilgrim Ooze is actually has some potential. It's like a baby piloted shredder. I think it's a good quality card. I don't know if it's going to be good enough. It's maybe something that can be pulled from the 2 mana Death Rattle minion in Demon Hunter, so it has some potential there. And again, it is just like a baby shredder. In that you're essentially getting a random 2-drop but like of a more consistent quality. So the highs are lower and the lows are higher. So it's somewhere in the middle in terms of the minion quality that you're getting. But I think it has some potential. I don't know if it's going to be good enough, but it is odd, and it is a miniature piloted shredder. So
Yeah, I think both these cards probably don't fit the format. There's not really, unless we see like heavy Pilgrim synergy, which we might, right? If we're getting multiple Pilgrim cards, maybe there's like significant payoffs to be revealed. But as standalone things, I don't think they're nearly good enough. I am interested in standard, I guess, with the 3-mana thing in, the Boar, the Death Rattle Demon Hunter stuff. But in Wild, not so much for either of these.
Well,
yeah,
I was good.
I mean, the Boar is just like not like very. It kind of it has a weird anti-synergy with the big payoff card in Death Speaker. So like, I've found that Death Rattle Demon Hunter is just better without it, even with the buff. So, but it does get pulled from the 3-mana Death Rattle minion in your odd Demon Hunter. So if you want to build an odd version of that, there's some potential there maybe.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was gonna go. Was like at the very beginning of the expansion, I played like an odd Death Rattle Demon Hunter with Blackthorn. I had to run Fugue and Stalag, and then the 5-mana 1/1 Death Rattle summon a 5/8 with Taunt. Like that's how desperate I was for Death Rattles. I think I'm very happy taking out my 5-mana 1/1 now for this card, right? Because 3 mana is good. And so now you can run the 3-mana 3/3. You can run Albatross, and now you can run Fluffy Pilgrim Ooze. And then you run Fugue and Stalag plus the Blackthorn. So like I'm kind of excited for it in that one specific deck. Barring any additional synergy that we get from the set when it comes to the Pilgrims. I mean, can you just imagine like summoning a mini-bot from this and you're just like Pilot Shredder PTSD all over again? So kind of excited for that, kind of not. But yeah, the Paladin spell I think just looks bad in our format and just nowhere near worth playing at all.
I mean, 7 mana cost is like we talked about with Mutant.
That's a lot.
That's a big number.
Yeah. All right, that's going to wrap it up for the card review so far. That is 8 out of the 35 cards. Again, this is coming out on June 3rd, so next week. Before our next episode, we're going to have the ability to play with all of these cards, so we will report back to you guys next week with what's busted, what's not, and what's working and what's not. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. That's going to kind of be time to wrap it all up. I hope you guys enjoyed the interview with Iksar and the first glance at the new mini set coming out next week. You guys, appreciate you guys hanging out. Let the people know where they can find you guys.
You can find me at RoffleHS on Twitter and Instagram, and Roffle on Twitch and YouTube.
And guys, you can find me at Corbettgames on Twitch and Twitter and YouTube and all that kind of stuff. So thank you again for listening and watching. And again, all the Patreon information that Meowth flagged at the middle of the show. So there'll be links to all that kind of stuff if you want to try and support the podcast and everything like that. Whole bunch of really cool rewards and things like that for the different tiers. So make sure you give a look at that if you want to help support the podcast as much as you can.
Of course.
Yeah, and thanks once again to Iksar for joining us for the Q&A that we had.
Yeah, and if you guys enjoyed it, make sure you guys, let us know down in the comments below. Let Iksar know that you enjoyed it. Give him a little bit more incentive to come on again next time. Of course, you can find me, twitch.tv/getmeout. You know where I am at on YouTube, all that kind of good stuff. And, of course, if you want to check out the podcast on the go, we're also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the podcast distributors. We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode, and we will see you guys again, same place, same time, next week. Later.